Good morning. My name is Michael Balboni, and I chair the Cyber and Physical Security Committee. I'd like to welcome my fellow board members, John Como, Dennis Trainer, and Pete Gonzalez. Anthony Pacenti has been excused from the meeting. I'd like to welcome the other members of the NYPA staff who are participating. This is a scheduled committee meeting which has been duly noticed and as required by the Open Meetings Law. And I'd like to call a regular meeting of the committee to order in pursuant to Section B4 of the Cyber and Physical Security Committee Charter. We begin with the adoption of the agenda. Any members of the committee have any amendments to the proposed agenda?
I have none. Happy to move it.
And ask for a second.
Second.
And all those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. The next portion of the meeting will be held in executive session. The meeting will resume in open session in approximately 45 minutes. And I'd like to have a motion to conduct the executive session.
So moved. Second.
Second. And all those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And motion to conduct the executive session has been voted on. And so pursuant to Public Officers Law, Section State of New York 105, and we would discuss matters regarding public safety and security. Thank you. I'd like to ask for a motion to resume open session.
So moved.
Second. Third.
Favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. There were no votes taken in the executive session. I want to ask Eric Meyers and Victor Costanza to come and give an update on cybersecurity.
Morning, trustees, NYPA management, and members of the public. We're going to give you a brief update on our cybersecurity program this morning. I'll start with a recap of our 2022 program progress, which will include our second annual independent assessment, again, using the NIST cybersecurity framework. We'll give you a brief look ahead to 2023, and then our Deputy CISO, Victor Costanza, is going to give you an update on some of the significant progress we've made around mitigating vulnerabilities this year. So let's move on to the next slide. Not going to go into a lot of detail on here. We're just going to call out a few selected highlights, but our activities in 2022 centered around three specific themes: enhancing our resilience, continuing to optimize our operations to be more focused and capable, and then laying the foundation for our digital future to be able to more effectively support things like digitalization and Vision 2030. It's important for us to be able to rethink how we effectively manage security to do that in order to improve security and enable the innovation that we need to have. So we started the year completing a program that we started in 2021 to enhance our resilience and our ability to respond and recover from ransomware. We brought those activities to a close, conducted some tabletop tests, and actually had an internal audit take a very focused look at the measures that we had put in place. And we're happy to report that that audit came back as satisfactory, with no identified observations or improvement opportunities. We continue to evolve our operations this year, again, making a greater emphasis on advanced threat hunting. How do we go look for adversaries in our environment that we may not know are there? Moving away from the traditional model of simply responding to alerts when our technology alarm bells go off. And we did that by integrating a managed security provider at mid-year that now handles all of our level 1 cybersecurity alerts, and they're an integral part of our team. What that did was it freed up our folks to then focus on understanding threat intelligence and learning how to hunt for actors in our environment. A big part of that was upskilling the team. And we actually, in that team, we achieved 13 professional certifications for our staff last year, which was quite an accomplishment. And we've got more to come this year. In laying the technology foundation for our digital future, this was a focus on putting some of the new technology capabilities in place. So we conducted a number of pilots that changed the way that people will access our NYPA users and customers will access our applications in the future. And we also put in place and laid a foundation for how we're going to manage identities of people that are accessing these things. So we conducted successful pilots of these capabilities, and we'll be expanding those and rolling them out in 2023. So I mentioned that we had an independent assessment. This is the second year in a row that we've done it. If we move to the next slide. We engage an external consultant to do a very in-depth independent view of our program to answer two questions. Number one, how are we doing on our overall maturity versus, and specifically versus the utility industry? And we went through the spider chart that you see on the right last year. Won't go into that in detail, but again, it shows that we've made significant year-over-year progress in our program, and we compare very favorably to our peers in industry. In fact, the peers that they assessed were, I think there was 14 different utilities. You see the profile of them at the bottom of the slide. You see, we made, again, continue to mature the program year over year. And the other important point here is that this is work that is never done. If we didn't continue to make investments, those scores would retract year over year. And that's because the adversary's capabilities continue to evolve. So we need to invest to keep ahead of them. And so we're going to continue to use this assessment year over year. This is going to inform our next generation strategy. And when we come back to you seeking our next set of funding later this year. So let's take a look ahead to 2023.
Before you jumping or no?
Oh, you go back. Got a question for you.
So, kudos for a favorable result. I fairly or not jumped the gaps that we're trying to close relative to where we are versus maturity, which is the end of this year, I guess.
Yep.
So asset management and access control and detection processes, so where we've made incremental progress, but the gap between where we are and maturity is fairly significant. Do we need additional resources to be allocated there? How do we play catch up? How do we get to where we want to be, need to be?
Great. It was actually more of a timing situation. That was part of the
The
technical
old
foundation.
timing answer?
Well, no.
Okay.
No,
It's all
it's
in
actually,
the timing?
it's timing when the assessment gets done, but we actually put some of that technical foundation in place in all three of those areas, but haven't fully rolled out those capabilities yet. So if we look at this and say 6 months, you'll probably see it looks a little more uniform.
So
with
we can
respect
close
to-
those, you're confident we can close those gaps appropriately?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
So, and again, the green line is where we're going to land at the end of the program at the end of this year. So we've made a lot of good progress. And now we've got to ask ourselves the question, where do we want to go next? And that's
The green line's a moving target?
It's a moving
it's
target.
not
it's a moving target.
okay.
So when we come back together to start working on the next strategy, we're going to have an internal discussion around, okay, what is NYPA's risk appetite around cyber, and what is it going to take to get us there? And that's where we're going to plot the next target line. And because the further out you go, it's more dollars to get there.
Well, and relative to that, and relative to peers. So I guess I feel really good that we're that much better than peers. On the other hand, how come we're that much better than our peers?
We're much better
Do we
than
need to be that much better than our peers? How relevant is that?
I would say that our peers probably aspire to be where we are, because we actually have some other comparison data too for other industries. For example, we've got data for the financial services sector. They're very mature in cybersecurity, and we're a little closer to where they are. And so this industry, and again, we haven't spoken to them to say where they aspire to be, but I have a hypothesis that I would say that they want to be where we are. And if you think about the threat landscape and focus on critical infrastructure going forward, just what we just talked about or what we've talked about in the past around attacks on substations and so forth, people have a motive to cause harm to critical infrastructure, and that's not going to stop.
It just seems it looks like an incredibly wide disparity, which if I'm in the peer group, I'm really concerned about. If we're held out to be, the standard, or if we're an outlier, I guess my question is, are we overspending, or have we invested disproportionate resources just to be the best for the sake of being the best? Or how do we, justify the return on that incremental investment?
Yeah, because we're in effect selling insurance.
Right.
When you think about it. So, and that's where when we come back together to set our next set of targets, it will be tied to NYPA's risk appetite. How much risk do we want to take on these? And, we might very well say, what, we've done good enough here. Maybe we don't need to invest here. Maybe we need to shift some of those dollars to these things that say are going to enable digitalization more. So as we move to things, delivering things in the cloud or helping our employees innovate faster, maybe we'll shift some of those things.
And the other thing, if I could just say, the whole framework here, this is not something that is something off the shelf. In other words, all of these applications, as they're put into the environment, need to be customized to a certain extent in user base, in terms of access control, and so that each of the users will have a different profile, also based upon what their threat profile is and what their risk appetite is. So it's not like you could sit there and say, well, you've invested in this level and you've got this protection. It very kind of varies. It's all customizable to the
Mhm.
environment.
I'm just reacting to the optics here and
Yeah, sure.
want to ensure we're not,
Yeah, it's a good point.
we haven't allocated excess resources, unnecessary resources.
Yeah.
Those 14 entities can't be, I mean, part of me says if they're peers, they can't be that far off the mark.
Mhm.
So I'd be interested to know what the array is in those 14 peers. Are we here and the 14 are over here? Or are the 14 scattered and we're at the top and there's just a wide dispersion, which creates such a gap? But anyway, I'm not trying to,
We'll get some more data and come back
Beat
to you
it up.
just to explain that. And the other important point here is, the shape of the target or the measurement doesn't need to be perfectly uniform and circular.
Oh,
Different
oh.
industries have different focus areas, different attributes around security, much more important to one industry versus another. So,
but we're above peers everywhere, even
Yep.
where I initially focused where we have our gaps. Even there, we're we're still well above
Yeah.
peers. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
great. So let's talk about how we're going to continue to move this forward. Let's flip to the next slide.
Or continue to widen the gap with our peers, right?
Correct.
Okay.
It's a race. So again, continuing the same three themes that we had, we're going to continue to build on our resilience. We're going to evolve some of what we do around some of our tabletop testing and our drills. We conduct drills to test our ability to respond. We know that we're not going to prevent everything, so it's really important that we have an ability to detect and recover quickly. And so we conduct tabletop exercises and drills regularly. We're going to add a new element to those this year. Normally some of those things are conducted just as pure paper tabletop exercises. We're actually going to introduce an actual technology platform now so that people that are participating in these drills and exercises are responding to what is a simulated actual cyber event to help, again, up our game around being able to respond to these things. So we also talked about the refreshing our capabilities. The adversaries look at all the tools that companies like us use, and they're always trying to figure out how to get around them. That requires us to have a continuous renewal process in place. We've talked in the past about the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain framework upon which we base the program. That's that end-to-end process that the bad guys use to target an organization. So we think about that process and think about how we can throw hurdles in their path and block them every step of that way to keep them from getting to the end of the chain. That's the framework we use. And so we continuously look at those capabilities. So this year, you're going to see us replace some of those that we think have become less effective over time and replace them with new ones. And then the foundation for our digital future, we're going to roll out those technical capabilities that we did the pilots of this past year and expand them broadly across the enterprise. Most notably is going to be one that's going to affect the way every NYPA employee accesses all of our services. And it's going to happen, it's based on a zero trust model, and it's going to be a much more consistent user experience for them, but also provide more security regardless of where they access these things from. And they'll have the same user experience, whether they're at a NYPA facility, at home, in a hotel, or anywhere, and they'll have a much more tightened down security posture. The other thing in that program that we're going to roll out this year, and we started it in late 2022, is making sure that we get the right guardrails in place to support innovation. That's refreshing all of our policies and standards in a way that enables innovation, but that cybersecurity doesn't delay the process. There's the old saying that cybersecurity always puts the no in innovation. So we're trying to move away from that model and come up with more rigorous standards to say, this is how you protect NYPA going forward, regardless of where NYPA's data is stored, used, or transmitted anywhere in the world, and regardless of the way it is accessed. So we started that in the latter part of this year, and we've got a lot of work to do this year. We've brought in some external consultants to help us come up with some very provocative policies and standards to help us do that. So I'm looking forward to a lot of activities there. And the other piece is, this was an unprecedented year again. They all seem to be unprecedented years when it comes to things like vulnerabilities. We have a steady stream of high profile vulnerabilities, vendors being targeted, supply chain risks, and so forth. And so that required us to really up our game on how we manage those risks and mitigate them so that NYPA is not impacted. And Vic Costanza and his team have done a lot of work to improve our processes there. We put some new metrics in place. So I'd like to ask Vic to come up and just kind of talk about the progress we've made over the last year.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Vic Costanza, Deputy Chief Information Security Officer. And as Eric alluded to, despite an increase in vulnerabilities, as you see in the graph here on the left, as well as that's worldwide, as well as the one in the upper right at NIPA, we have been able to increase. We've been and
Define vulnerabilities for us.
vulnerabilities are flaws in software that could be targeted to exploit and gain access to a system or to basically negatively impact a system. And we're always trying to keep ahead of those vulnerabilities so that we can keep them patched and reduce the exposure to our environment from those threat actors. So despite that increase, we've been able to reduce our time to mitigate these vulnerabilities overall through process improvements, which include changes in our governance to reduce the time to remediate, as well as tool sets that we've implemented in the environment that help to reduce our time to actually patch the vulnerabilities and reduce them from being exposed to those threat actors. In addition to the kill chain protections that Eric alluded to earlier. So very positive story. And you can see in the lower right there how we've reduced those average days to mitigate those vulnerabilities and protect them from being exposed.
What would cause our vulnerabilities to increase by 100% as I look at that relative to the worldwide trends, which is, much less significant than that? I mean, we're
right.
Am I looking at that correctly? We've
Yes.
more than doubled.
Right. And it does
well, that
fluctuate. but-
Worldwide's up 10%.
Right. As we're implementing more digital technologies in the environment, we're needing to keep those assets safe as part of this program. So that's a factor. And we're keeping pace with it, with those investments that we've made to actually reduce the time to remediate, even though we are having a bigger digital footprint. So we've realized those efficiencies through those
Is there
processes.
anything we can do on the front end to minimize the increase in vulnerabilities, or is that inevitable?
That's
it's great that
inevitable.
we're mitigating them, but if we don't create them to begin with, we don't have to mitigate them. I mean,
Those vulnerabilities are inherent in the software. The vendors that produce the software, sometimes there's coding flaws and other things that are inherent to those technologies that are initially known, but then are discovered later. So it's something that we can't control from that aspect, but we build in the protections and process to improve.
do we do look backs on those vendors though? I mean, or do we weed out vendors who don't?
We-
So
We're
this has-
sending us stuff Swiss cheese rather
do.
than.
Right, so this has a history that goes back a long time. Whenever you put a software piece out there are problems in the software. It goes into stream of commerce. And it used to be that there was a period of time when you put a software out in the wild, as it were, and then you identify that there'd be a vulnerability, and then you'd issue a patch,
Mhm.
and the patch would come in and fix that.
Mhm.
Then it got to so that the bad guys were able to detect the vulnerability with 0 day. In other words, right as soon as you put it out there, they know the vulnerability and they go after it. It's called 0-day attack. It's probably the most dangerous thing that you can have for an organization because there's really no protection immediately. What they're doing here is they're scanning their whole environment. They know they're anticipating the vulnerabilities. They're coming in and they're patching as quickly as they can. And that bottom line is probably the most important thing in terms of reducing the amount of time that the vulnerabilities exist. Because unfortunately, it's inherent in all the software that's put out there that there are certain types of vulnerabilities. The more software you use, the more vulnerabilities you're going to encounter. So the effort to try to modernize, digitize, and secure the environment is going to necessarily mean that you've got more applications coming on, and those applications have more vulnerabilities. But again, from my perspective, the most important chart is that line, the bottom chart, where the line is going down in terms of time.
Right. And as we've added capabilities, we're, like Trustee Balboni said, we're actually scanning the environment proactively, trying to find these vulnerabilities before they can actually be exploited through the tool sets that we've incorporated. And yes, to answer your question, we do look at the vendors through our vendor risk assessment process. We have it's built into our strategic supply management procurement process. So if there are vendors that have issues with remediating vulnerabilities or providing, patches in a timely way, those vendors we will look at as a higher risk and make sure that there's either mitigations in place or select a different vendor that isn't as exposed.
And it's more ignorant than informed, but as I think of this, if I'm looking at this, I'm saying, okay, we're doubling our exposure year over year.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'd want to ensure we've got the capacity to mitigate
Yeah.
that exposure before I create it.
Yeah.
So
So-
how do we ensure we are staying ahead, and or if we can't mitigate the relative increase in exposure, you know, how we step out?
We just consider this, all vulnerabilities are not the same. In other words, there's some applications that are critical, there are some applications that are not, but they all have vulnerabilities. So that number takes into account, you know, critical
Yeah, okay, but-
vulnerabilities and versus things that just are part of the daily business that
And-
the organization does.
And just like we were talking about with the substations and designs, we build in as part of our design of the cyber systems, these layered protections to
Right.
actually mitigate those vulnerabilities before we even implement the system. So we have layered or defense in depth approach that Eric mentioned earlier to
So as
reduce
you
the
look ahead to
exposure of those.
23, what do you project vulnerability, the increased exposure to be in 23? Will it increase incrementally? Is it different 21 to 22, or are we?
I feel worldwide they will continue to increase because they are targeted and
But will
No,
our
but
individual
ours will-
exposure double again this year at the pace we're moving, or more than double?
it will increase.
Yeah.
I can't say for sure it'll double, but with the additional capabilities that we have to discover vulnerabilities, we will find more. As we deploy more digital technologies, we'll find more, but we will continue to mitigate them proactively and keep those days to, mitigate vulnerabilities that come out down at that lower level that you see at the lower right.
So
couple important
important to
points.
consider is that there was a slide before where they talked about, the White House announced about over a year ago, zero trust was what we were supposed to drive towards. NIPA uses microsegmentation as one of the strategies to prevent the type of broad-based impacts to any type of vulnerability. So that means basically you don't have the ability to see the entire horizon in your environment, in your domains. So you basically only can go here, these microsegmentations.
Right. Yeah.
That is just one of the protections that you have to essentially take out the potential for any type of really bad effects from the vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities can happen, the bad guys are scanning the environments all the time. In fact, if you put in an application and you misalign the application, the bad guys can come in immediately and use that as an exploit. So again, it's about monitoring, it's about detecting, it's about having this segmentation so you don't prevent the horizon, with the horizontal movement across
Exactly.
the domain and enterprise.
Defense in depth approach.
Right.
And then when a vulnerability does come out, we have those protections in place, but we're also reducing the time that they are actually exposed. Even if they're on the inner layer where they're not exposed, we're reducing that time so that, through that defense in depth, we're able to reduce any exposure even internally.
Well,
And-
again,
and-
just ignorantly, I'm just looking and say, okay, at the beginning of the year, we were exposed for 30 days. So the good news is at the end of the year, we got that down to a week, it looks like.
Right.
So it doesn't give me a lot of assurance that as we're rolling things out, 30 days of exposure sounds like a bad situation. So as a board member, I'm saying, okay, I don't want
Right.
to see vulnerabilities created where we're exposed for 30 days. Assure me that we're in a position to
Mhm.
And
do
even.
damage control.
Rob, Rob.
Sorry,
Oh, go ahead.
we can let it go, but you get my,
No, we
Yeah.
get the point. Eric,
Yeah,
you
just,
wanted
just,
to
just,
chime in?
yeah, just,
Let me just finish. So, I think there are a number of different dynamics here. Point taken in terms of looking at that. We assess the types of vulnerabilities that we're experiencing. We have environments, and as Michael just said, microsegmentation is just one part of our strategy of how to limit. So if we do know there are vulnerabilities, how we're managing those. The one thing that we do, and we do extensive testing long before we introduce it into our production environment, even with this segregated environment. So we know, we could say, hey, here's a vulnerability, working with the vendor, we do the testing to understand to what extent there are risks. So even, not all, I think Vic said it, all vulnerabilities are created equal, they're not. So while there may be longer times to resolve or mitigate, they're understood and it's sort of acceptable in terms of risks. So there's order in which we can implement the changes across the enterprise as we become more and more dependent on digital systems in the process. So that will affect the time frame. I think what we're trying to illustrate here is we're shortening that time, but along the way, we've assessed the risk. We know we can manage the risk, and it's not introduced into our production environment, especially when we're looking at interdependencies between, let's say, classic IT systems and our operations technology that's affecting our G&T or generation and transmission environments. So there are a number of factors at play here. But point taken, the whole point is how can we try to mitigate, anticipate it? Part of the testing and the segregation is critical to that because we're stopping it at the gate straight away.
It's built into our project process to actually do that testing with the vendor proactively as part of our acceptance testing. I know I was involved personally with it with our SCADA and EMS systems on the operations technology side. And, like we were showing here, even though we've reduced the time to remediate mitigate doesn't necessarily mean those were exposed to the outside. We're just trying to, reduce the time to actually patch.
Right. Yeah. Just a couple of key points to remember around this whole space. So when we talk about mitigating vulnerabilities and so forth, but when it comes back to risk, a vulnerability that cannot come in contact with a threat can't come into contact with it at its core does not pose a risk to us. And so that kind of figures into the prioritization of this whole thing. And so we take that into consideration when we're thinking about the mitigation plans. If you keep the threat from intersecting with the vulnerability, it doesn't pose a risk to us. The question about why we seem to have jumped so much year over year, the chart on the left reflects the universe of all software products out there. We don't use all software products.
Understood.
And so we just may, again, the products that we have chosen to use. The other important point is software isn't getting worse in terms of vulnerabilities. The bad guys have gotten better at figuring out how to find vulnerabilities in them that have been longstanding. And oftentimes we find this in things that have been in place for years that people haven't tried to target. The bad guys will figure out using some advanced techniques, figure out how they can punch a hole in it. And these things are broadly deployed. And that's where we see some of the things that we've seen over the last year. So,
But your questions are really good because we don't always equate vulnerabilities to risk, and we should. Not all of vulnerability is a risk. And that's the thing. It's hard to capture that graphically and illustrate that. But so your questions are exactly right. Cybersecurity is such a difficult concept initially because there's so many different terms of art. And there's all these metrics that are not necessarily familiar to a lot of people. So your view of this visualization is a really good thing for us to consider as we present the information going forward.
Agreed.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Any other questions?
Great. Any other questions? All right. Larry Mallory, please come on up and talk about the physical side of security.
Good morning. I'm Larry Mallory. I'm the Senior Director of Security and Crisis Management here at the Power Authority, and I appreciate a few minutes this morning to talk to you about some recent industry incidents, some of them high profile, and NYPA's ongoing response. If you could give me the next slide, please. So in our industry, in the last few months, there have been a couple of high profile substation incidents where bad actors have damaged electric substations, caused outages. In one case in North Carolina, 55,000 customers out. In another case in the state of Washington, 13,000 customers out. In some cases, arrests made. In some cases, investigation ongoing. There's no indication that these are connected in any way, but there is an industry-wide response. There is an opportunity for us to share intelligence and information, to conduct analysis, discover trends, and to share best practices throughout the organization. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today and a little bit about NYPA's response. Eric mentioned on the cyber briefing threat actors' motivations. So the same thing. We see motivations on the physical security side. In some cases, we're more concerned about the results than the motivation, right? The motivation to damage a substation. The result is really more what we are concerned about. However, the motivation can provide us with an advanced clue. So not so much in the case of like copper theft or burglary or things like that, but in some of the other cases, conspiracy theorists, domestic violent extremists, potentially there's chatter on the internet that our analysts can review and give us a heads up. So we want to exhaust any single tool we can to stay ahead of this problem. which is an ongoing everyday problem. Just yesterday, you may have seen in the news, there was in Baltimore, Maryland, there was a plot that was uncovered about a white supremacist group plotting to damage electric substations down there. So anything that we can do to stay ahead of it, we want to leverage. As a result of some of these things, we are seeing a number of changes in our regulations, numerous guidelines that have been released. One of the big things for us is the NERC SIP standards, critical infrastructure protection standards. SIP 14 is the physical security standard, and our regulator NERC has been directed to review that standard and come up with improvements by April 14th of this year. So we're remaining abreast of that, trying to position ourselves to respond to that. And we are spending a lot of time coordinating with our partners, NPCC, other utilities, New York State Department of Public Service, New York State Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. If I could have the next slide, please. I did want to reassure you, the board, the public, that NYPA is fully aware of these incidents, that we have a prepared and capable security staff. That includes our union security officers, our security management teams, and a number of other internal partners, cybersecurity, resilience, strategic supply management, engineering. So security is really a team sport. We are all working together to protect the organization. Also, we are not starting from scratch. We have a defined security plan that we execute and implement every day. We've discussed that plan in this meeting before, and we're continually evolving that plan and basically applying learnings to that plan to stay ahead of the threat. We are collaborating with other partners, like I mentioned. I do want to point out we have received and continue to receive great support from the New York State Police, who are helping us on a daily basis. We're using tools and technology that we already have in place, such as mobile security cameras, intelligence tools, analysts that we have applied to this threat. So using tools that we already have in place to stay ahead of this. We are using drones to map out and identify possible avenues of approach and possible risk positions at substations. Like as I said, we've deployed additional mobile surveillance units. We are standing up a cross-functional team, which includes some of the players I mentioned, to look at not only security hardening efforts, but also improve our rapid response capability, or recognizing that part of security is the ability to respond. We talked about the vast area that we're trying to protect and sort of the balance between protection and then rapid response. And there is a balance there where rapid response comes into play, you know, at least as important as physical security. Just want to provide you a high level today of the team's efforts. I do plan to come back to you and talk to you about the team's progress, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
So your rapid response embedded in that is recovery. Larry, is that what you mean by rapid?
By rapid response, I mean the ability to recover from an outage. We know the vast majority of, you know, we're luckier than our distribution partners in that we have fewer substations, although 33% of our substations are high impact rated. So we have fewer, some of them more important, and certainly all the transmission lines running the length of the state. It's not reasonable. You know, it's probably not responsible, cost effective to say we're going to harden everything all the time. We just can't do it. But what we can do is come up with you know, one, I don't want to make you think we have no rapid recovery. We do have some rapid recovery capabilities here at NYPA, but we're continually evolving and we're working on fine tuning that so we can get even better, so that when there's an incident, do we have some mobile units that we can deploy? Are those things hardened and protected so we're not rolling out another target? Because part of the successful strategy here is the ability to rapidly recover, to get the lights back on, you know, balanced with protection.
Yeah, and sure we've deployed enough resources to that.
Right.
And are prepared to respond. Okay, great.
Any other questions? Larry, thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you all.
Like at this point, like to take up the consent agenda, which consists of meeting minutes, and it's before the committee for adoption. Ask for a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Third.
Say aye.
Oh, aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. The next meeting of the Cyber and Physical Security Committee will be scheduled, it's scheduled to be held on July 25th in 2023. I'd like to have a motion to close the meeting.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
The
Aye.
meeting is closed. Thank you very much for your participation.